First, I'd like to thank all of today's guests. One of the guests is unfortunately missing. We hope that he will join us later. If he does, we will of course let him into the debate, and we hope that he will cooperate as well. Otherwise, instead of 5 guests, today we will have only 4. I will try to speak a little slower than my normal tempo so that Špela will be able to interpret as we go for the English listeners. For now, this is just our guest from Hungary. Before we start, maybe I'd introduce our guests today. I'll start the way I see them. First, at my right is Milan Dekleva. He is our author in focus of Vilenica. He is a playwright, poet, writer. Next, we have Jani Oswald. He is a poet from Austrian Carinthia, writes fictions, essays. He works with numerous experiments. He experiments with different genres and types of writing. Jani, hello. After that, there is Kristina Hočevar. She's a Slovenian poet. I also like to point out that she is a Slovenist, which we are not many. In her poetry, we can see her feeling for language. Sometimes in poetry, I miss this. Kristina, hello. Our only foreign guest for right now is Zoltán Danyi. He's a Hungarian writer who was born in Vojvodina in Serbia. I'm very happy that he's with us, and I welcome him to Vilenica Festival. First via screens and hopefully soon live.
Hello everyone, and it's good to meet you.
Skratka, zdaj pa, da mogoče vsem ne bi preveč okolišli, letošnja tema...
So, not to be too long, the theme of this year's Vilenica is fear and courage. We chose this after about a year of meetings. Meetings took place before the festival, and we were talking about different themes, guests, events that will take place. This time, of course, we could not miss the circumstances in which we lived. These were social as well as political circumstances. A lot of things have been happening in Europe, among those what we will be talking about today. There has been a great restriction of human rights, exploitation of pandemic circumstances for political propaganda, for political strengthening of the power. There's also something that offered some hope. We saw poets and writers at the front. They were very active in the streets, talking in favor of the freedom of speech, of rights of the workers. They also shared their literature online for free. And this was in the time when many people were not able to afford to have their own libraries at home. And in that way, they were not without literature. To begin this conversation, I thought of a question that I had on my mind in the past few days. I would like to look back on lockdown, on restrictive measures. Literary activity was one of the few activities which was not affected as much, especially in comparison with other performing arts. We cannot, however, go past some problems. A lot of residencies and grants were cancelled, festivals were cancelled and events. Many projects and books were delayed. On top of that, we have social isolation, housing conditions, stress under the threat of infection, which increased inequalities in society. And we also have to mention that writing is not among the highest paid professions. So writers have different housing conditions that maybe some other better paid professions. To start, maybe I'd like to ask about your view of this. How was your work affected by the situation? Did you feel the situation of the pandemic directly and the restrictions that I mentioned? Did you have any help from the government or other systemic institutions? Maybe we will start with the Slovenian guests. We have two who live in Slovenia and Jani who lives in Austria and Carinthia. And after that, we will give the word to our guest from Hungary. Is there anyone who wants to start? Jani, might I ask you to start? Because you come from a slightly different perspective, but still close enough to our situation. Yes, of course. The basic question for me is, can you live with poetry, regardless of the epidemic? For me, personally, the answer has always been no. Personally, I took a slightly different path. I'm a lawyer working in economy. I did not need the supports, and as such, I was not personally affected. However, I think there is a more general question to this, not only about poetry and whether you can live off of that. How much support was given to restoration? How much was it given to economy and how much to other workers? If we look at that, we can see that the way the society has estimated the value of culture. For Austria, I could say that the Minister for Culture had to step away because she did not put enough effort into it, not only for institutions, but also for individuals. I also work some in Slovenia, but I noticed that the Minister for Culture, for example, did not want to help individuals. He did not want to give the status of self-employed culture worker to a rapper. We can see that the general situation was even more drastic. Personally, I was not very affected. Of course, there were no performances and so on. But in the context of society, I have to say that we can see that the state, especially I can talk about Austria and maybe also about Slovenia, that the situation is not good at all. Kristina, I thought what Jani said and pointed out was very interesting. We should not look away from the situation of precarious workers, which are in Slovenia usually culture workers as well. The epidemic has shown as well that it's not only the fight about the survival of writers, but that writers are precarious workers that are usually overlooked. By your words, I can add that in this situation of crisis, it was even more visible that relationships in society, how we work, and what value we have were more pointed out. I can also say that my poetry book was out in February as planned, but we had to cancel residencies and performances. I also had my first exhibition, which luckily was able to go on as planned. But we were only able to have about 5 people at the same time. But it was open for a whole month, luckily. I do not live off of writing as well as Jani. I never really wanted that. I did not apply for stipends, for grants. So I did not experience this situation. I was not affected. There were, however, other worries, other concerns. My concern was especially mental health. Because I teach, I also have contact with younger people and with their concerns, including housing situations. It was hard to follow this, and it's a thing that it's often left behind, that it's often not looked after. In the beginning, you use the past tense as if it was already over, but we are in different phases. I still wonder what will be the next chapter of this situation, because there are different phases. Yes, I did use the past tense because I'm an optimist. However, the situation is such that it's hard to be an optimist. Milan, you are very connected to performing arts. Not long ago, we talked about an opera that you've written and so on. How did you view this situation? Theater, for example, was in fact very affected. There were no performances in the theater, or they were completely different in nature. They were recorded, for example, and this is not what theater is. If you record a theater play, it becomes something completely different. It loses the contact with the public that theater needs. Yes, you're right. For me personally, I was not very affected. My status is similar to Kristina's and Jani's. I always had a job throughout my life. In that way, I was able to keep my freedom with writing. However, I was affected when it comes to music and theater, as you mentioned. I wrote a cantata, and of course, due to the pandemic, it was not performed. We had to wait for over a year. I can imagine the problem of the contact in theaters. You lose the public and it's hard to get them back. It's the same for musical performances. I think it's very complicated. Especially heard were young authors, young actors, and other artists who deal with theater. They don't have time to wait. For them, this is very stressful. For me, it's not hard to wait, as I've already done a lot, and I'm kind of calm now, but it must be very, very stressful for younger people. Of course, yeah, there were no practices, no rehearsals. It's hard to keep contact with other actors as well. Of course, the work is completely different, including the technical teams. They were perhaps on the edge of survival, or they were forced to look for new jobs, some new interests. They had to leave what they worked very hard for. I think this is indeed very hard. The virus is indeed a very inhuman factor that changed the world. It's completely changed it. It's turned it upside down. I think we will be searching for quite some time. Later, we'll talk about what really happened. Maybe at this point, we will listen to our Hungarian guest and his perspective. Mostly, I am interested in two things. What was the situation in Hungary about culture and culture workers, for writers? And how did you experience this crisis and restriction of performances and so on?
I have to correct you a little bit because yes, I'm a Hungarian writer and I write in Hungarian, but I was born in Vojvodina, and at the moment I live in Vojvodina. So I spend most of my time in Vojvodina, not in Hungary. Before the pandemic, I used to travel a lot more to Hungary, and I was present in Budapest as much as in Vojvodina. But due to restrictions and travel restrictions, and I wasn't able to cross the border for months, or more than about a year exactly, and therefore I decided to stay in Vojvodina because well, I make a living out of rose growing, and we have roses in Vojvodina. This is a small family business, and I have to be here if I have to decide where to live in a condition like this. I have to decide to be in Vojvodina and to work with roses. As a writer, no, I didn't have any help from the Hungarian government. But to be honest, I wouldn't accept money from this Hungarian government anymore. So it's not important whether I was offered a help or not. I wouldn't accept it.
No, mogoče še vendarle, kakšne so pa seveda.
But however, still you might know the best. What is the situation, the circumstances like in Hungary? We hear a lot in the news. I imagine you know about privatization. A lot of money into our government comes from Hungary. Maybe this is some kind of a prediction for Slovenia, what might happen. Is the Hungarian government using the pandemic for other goals, other objectives?
Definitely, yes. As far as I see, the Hungarian government has strengthened its power. I mean, ridiculously, so to say. They use the pandemic to gain incredible strength in politics, but they didn't really do much to stop the spreading of the virus. So they didn't do a good job in any possible sense, but somehow the propaganda machine still works so effectively that most of the Hungarians still believe the fake news that this government is presenting, which is sad, quite sad.
No, zdaj smo seveda pri drugem vprašanju.
Now we come to our second question. Thank you for this. I think this was a good introduction into our second question that I thought about. I think, however, then we are in an unusual time, an interesting time, said conditionally, where we can talk about two things. On the one hand, right now, in Slovenia and elsewhere in Europe, we see the proliferation of hate speech and fake news that are connected with the pandemic and with conspiracy theories about the pandemic and so on. Most of the public, or most of the critical public, agree that it has to be stopped. We are not maybe in agreement on a way of stopping this, and we haven't found the solution, but we agree that we have to stop neo-Nazism, for example. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a justified fear that as soon as we start restricting the freedom of speech online, we will see this being used by not only the national systems, but also by corporations. We know that Facebook said that it's restricting fake news on its network, but it also deleted some activist statements from the left. For example, when we talked about the law about waters, some sides were lobbying that were against this law. They were blocked and they were not able to share some statements. Being writers who work with speech, you know the effects of this. Where do you see the line between restricting hate speech and fake news? Do you think it has to be restricted? And on the other side, how to stop it without having the institutions, the state, restricting our discussions about the pandemic? If we start with our guest from Vojvodina.
I was thinking about this question a lot, even years ago, before the pandemic, and I was trying to give answers, my answers to this situation many times, but I found it really hard. I found it really hard how to deal with this. And let me tell you that when I received your invitation letter to participate at Vilenica festival, I was reading Hölderlin, and I don't read his works quite often, but from time to time I return to his poems. And the day when I received your letter, I was reading one of his elegies titled "Bread and Wine," and in this poem there are two lines which I think answer the topic of this year's festival, which is fear and courage, directly. So I think it's a good answer for this topic, which is and these two lines speak about a bolder life and about staying awake during the night. I think we need courage to live our life. And I also think that we need courage to stay awake during this night that we got somehow into once again. Because I really think that we are in a deep darkness again. And as writers, I think we have only one tool, which is writing. So we don't have any other means except words. And I think we can try to do our best to do writing. And this is probably the only answer, only legitimate answer that we can give to the situation, to produce good works of literature, to try to write as good as we can and let the works speak. Because I think that I'm not sure about this situation and how can we affect it other than by the means of literature. And in my impression, our task is to stay awake in this night and to watch what we see in us and around us, and to try to name things that we see, to define what we see. And again, we need courage to define what we see. I also think that we need courage not to try to dissolve this night, this darkness, just to name it and to define it, and not necessarily fight against it. I'm not sure if we should fight against it or not. We just definitely have to watch as good as we can and tell what we see.
No, mislim, da je to sjajno izhodišče, drugače mislim, da je...
I think this is a brilliant point. The author was Friedrich Hölderlin. Rotten Wine was the elegy you talked about.
Exactly, yes.
Milan is also acquiescing. How do the Slovenian guests see this? And Jani from Austria, of course. Is this view the same with us? Is it something we can understand better as writers? Do we have some solutions, or is this something that we cannot yet solve? I think writers are not exceptions here. It's a dilemma indeed. On the one hand, when it comes to the epidemic, contact has to be restricted. But the question is what we should do with culture. Should we align with fitnesses, with restaurants, and so on? If I take note of what was going on, it wasn't clear enough where, when, and to whom we should go, we should restrict. There were specific moments where we had to go into lockdown. I can understand that. But the question is when to release this. If I compare Slovenia and Austria, we could hear on the news that there are different lobbies at work. I think writers do not have a strong enough lobby who could influence politics. This is indeed an objective dilemma. The second thing is, of course, the exploitation of this kind of situation for censorship and restriction and breaking of democratic rights and achievements. I'd say that anti-democrats and autocrats will always find all kinds of reasons to do what they want to do. The epidemic was, in any case, a reason. It was a general danger that came from outside. Some would think it right for people who come from one state. So this kind of a stressful situation for society is, of course, for populists, an extremely good situation. They just need to find a guilty party, and like that you can kind of do what is needed politically to achieve what you want. I think in different countries it was the economic lobbies that spoke in favor of hotels, for example. In some countries, including Slovenia, this became this came towards political opponents and groups. I am very worried about this and how this will go on. Maybe a question for Kristina and Milan, who are mostly poets. For Milan, of course, we know that it's not just a poet, and most of you are not just one thing, but as Milan and Kristina are also poets, it's very common in Slovenian literature that poetry is the most in touch with social reality. But when it comes to the novel, it's far behind. How do poets react to the current social situation? We often talk about engaged poetry. What is it? The protests were very well attended by intellectuals, writers, and poets. But can a poet who is with his body on the street, does this mean that his writing is on the streets as well, or how can he achieve that? This is not a political poetry of every day. We moved a bit forward, but yes, I think it's a personal decision of a character. You have to decide whether it makes sense to protest with your body or whether to do it with your poetry very directly. I think in our country it's strong among female poets who do this with various activisms. And it's not less valuable on the artistic level. There are also different ways of achieving this, which maybe not more sophisticated, but not as direct. It's not as actively political. So ways in which you can enforce your position. I think that the protest and criticism is one of my main things. It's the way I work. The question is, who is reached by this? Is there a group of people who follows poetry and art, or does it have a wider impact? I don't think it has a wider impact. I am afraid it does not. But we want to achieve that. There's a lot of things happening on micro levels. A lot of things are connected between each other. But our but I think it's also connected with the role of literature in the society. For example, when I was in China, I realized that even my poetry, the Slovenian poetry, it has a completely different value in China. It can be threatening, whereas here I don't see it in this way. I remember a Turkish author who was talking about how her friends were in prison because of their writings. So it depends on the position of literature. As Zoltán said, we have to be awake, we have to write. We have to think about what is the imperative of our writing. It's interesting that in the abundance of fake news, the situation is becoming such that in reality it goes ahead of fiction. There are elements, there are comical situations in which you think that the universe is against the individual. But now we live in a time where it seems that the presence of thinking or of perception of this, that reality is against individuals. And everything in this reality is threatening, and we can't believe the official interpretation, we can't believe the media, we can't believe the power, we can't believe the science, we cannot believe anyone. Yes, I think you're right. Here I'd also link myself to Zoltán. I don't think we should hide it. I agree that we have to go through. We have to find the crack from which a new beautiful rose will grow. I'm sure Zoltán knows what kind of a miracle this is. About engaged literature, I think in the same way as Kristina. I don't support this kind of direct exposition of self, in which we talk about wishes of Maikowski. We have a cloud in our pants. We all have that cloud. Let me try to illustrate this with a quote I have here. I think it's a great starting point about what we talk about. It's also connected to Edvard Kocbek and his complementing pair. Drago Jančar, who is one of perhaps the best contemporary European writers, starts his essay with the title Art, Time and History like this. In the collected works of Edvard Kocbek, we can find some writings of Kocbek, and here Jančar quotes, "Me and time, we have a unusual relationship. Time impacts processes, and yet a human cannot impact the time. Nobody can know what his impact of the time will be. It's hard to reach your objectives. The artist is happier even though he is not strong. He cannot impact time. He can impact time, but he not change it. I will end this quotation here, but I think it is essential. It talks about how a revolution can change the world, can turn it upside down, which also this parasite did. But, however, what it makes does not have a long echo. It cannot bring some new values. And the artist cannot change the world, but it can affect it. What does this mean? It's not a paradox. Kotzebue is certain that we have to change the world by a revolution in our minds, but not only in our minds, but also in our hearts, which is essential with Kotzebue. So what has to be changed is the human's essential, that is emotional and existential affectedness. Here I'd like to connect with all the gibberish that comes through new social networks. These are empty. People don't even sign, they remain anonymous. So there's no courage there. They're also not afraid of anything because no one can hurt them. They become empty shells without a soul and a heart. Here, I think that we have to see what is challenging for humans. The role of science here, I think that the technology has gone its own course. It's starting to eat away the substance of humans. I think there are a way of changing people. The return of sensibility for others, which is not only local, or maybe it's not just national or linked to one language, but it has to be universal. Otherwise, it is not what it's supposed to be. This for a start. Thank you, Milan. That was indeed a good beginning, a good start. I think we saw Stefan just for a moment there, but maybe something happened. Maybe there's a bad network connection. I think we'll have to go on with just as we are. We mentioned a few times something about the responsibility of writers, and especially about this, how writers or literature lost their power. We live in a time where, as Kristina mentioned as well, where writers are jailed, not only writers of fiction, but also journalists and columnists. They are jailed in Belarus, in Turkey, and even here in Slovenia, they get very high fines for expressing their political views. And because we live in a time where literature is losing its value, also associations are losing their value. So the Vilenica festival is also a proof of that. It wished to support some dissident writers and get some more power. How do you see this perspective? So if we lived in the olden days, however, the structure of power changed, and it also influenced the fact that writers are less protected. They have less international protection that they have. They used to have, or maybe I'm wrong. I think, however, it's interesting. I don't know about the situation elsewhere, but in Slovenia right now, books are very well sold. I think that at least our publishers, we are having a comeback of books. Books are very well sold. But still, I think we still have the same powerlessness of writers. So how can we even protect our Belarusian colleagues and colleagues from countries where they're being jailed, where they are persecuted? I don't know who to ask to speak. Jani, maybe you? That's a difficult question. You said that the structure of power changed, they shifted, even the public changed. There's not a single public anymore. There are different bubbles, not a single community that sometimes exist in parallel. It's in these in these circumstances, it's also harder for writers' associations. What to do with writers? Writers are, in a way, public figures. They have a certain responsibility, but the question is also on whose side you're standing. Let's not talk about the current situation in the pandemic. Let's go a while back. For example, the breakup of the multi-ethnic Yugoslavia. Where were the writers then? Some were on the side of the nationalists, others went on the other side, and the third group was nowhere, as it is in life. I don't only talk about writers. I think I'm talking about the entire intellectual group. They had a political role that was also taken up by the Academy of Sciences and Arts. Let's not say, I don't think writers are like a higher ethical or moral group. Some are, but it's not true. Some are here, some are there. In the end, it's the ones that come after us who will see the real situation. They will be able to estimate the situation. I don't believe in the general role of a writer. However, the individual has to define his or her position. And do we talk about it all the time? Cultural workers have to take up a position. So, yes. You can't always be an opportunist. You have to take a position. Zoltán, maybe this could be a question for you. How do you see the circumstances in Hungary, for example, for critical journalists and other writers? The situation is not benign for them.
Yes, I would like to refer to Kristina first, because she said that, if I understood correctly, that she said that poets or writers don't have a wider impact. And I think this is the same in Hungary. So writers don't have true impact to social life anymore. And I don't know how to change it, except what I said earlier, that we have to focus on writing and write very good books. So if we can do this, then I think we did the best what we can do. And if the readers or so to say people need literature and they need our books, then the books are there and the writers are there. If they don't need it, and if they don't want to read our books, we still have to write them, I think. But if they don't read our books, then I ask them, please do not ask for our bodies. We will not give our bodies if you don't need our books. So we will not protest directly if you don't read what we write for you. I think that would be what I would suggest regarding this really complex situation. And I also liked what Jani said about the communities, that the community is not a single community anymore. That we have these bubbles, and it makes life interesting. In fact, maybe it's frightening, but it's interesting as well. And if we can do something with it as writers, then it's perfect. But we have to accept what there is. I mean, I don't necessarily want to change what I see what I probably see as bad thing. I don't necessarily want to change it. I just want to understand it, and if there is a kind of influence, then I hope it will come through books, and not through direct influence. Which is, again, as Kristina said, we don't have any wider impact, so it's tricky.
Mogoče na tej točki, Kristina.
Maybe at this point, Kristina, Zoltán referred to your answers a lot. I think it's interesting as well that it's also a question, why writers today do not have a wider impact. I think this is one of the interesting questions. But how do you see this situation? My question was also supposed to be operational. How do we, in this day and age, without a financial structure, without a possibility to take care of the members that are being persecuted? I think the powerlessness of writers says something. Writers and critical thinking is in danger. And this is saying that writers do not have power in this society. This is a causal situation, like a chicken and an egg. It's hard to tell it apart. Yes, and that's why it's also hard to answer this. You started with the Slovenian Association of Writers, how it was always critical of regimes, of Nazi regime and communist regimes and so on. It was also quite effective. This year's mission was supposed to touch upon this. It was supposed to touch upon the exploitation of natural sources and the ever-growing poverty. I cannot speak about the effectiveness of PEN, but it's a symbolic gesture. It has to promote itself to the general public. I do not know a lot of specific cases, but I think when it had the option to move someone out of the country where he or she was in danger, but I think PEN was able to help. It's ironic. In countries where you are in danger, your word has a higher value, but in countries where you are free to create, it all becomes it all melts down onto the same level. It's something I was thinking about. It's ironic. So what is the power of criticism if it's very relaxed, if you're not sanctioned about it? I don't have a wiser answer at this moment. Yes, I don't think we will save the world and the PENs around the world, and it's not on us to do so. And if we go towards the end of our discussion, I don't want to make it too long via recording, and so that we don't lose the public who might be looking. I would like to invite them now to come to the live events of the Vilenica festival, where authors, creators are meeting. It's a way of cultural living, a social life. I think we also give a power to literature and to culture. On this note, I'd like to ask you a very short question that Kristina also mentioned, that I was maybe too optimistic by talking about these things in the past tense. I will not ask you about a new wave, but I would like to ask if you are optimistic or pessimistic about the new normal. We talk about the new normal a lot in the past days, but we talk about what it will be. We talked about the politics exploiting the pandemics, and so on. I maybe mentioned some positive effects of the pandemic, but not so positive. It's the reaction to the pandemic that can be positive. The pandemic is not over. We are looking at a new wave. We're probably looking at new lockdowns. But do you still have some optimism that we will come out of this, that we will learn something out of it? The pandemic did not bring anything new. It just showed what was in society and it brought it out. Can we learn something as a society that we saw the reality of social inequalities and the inequality of power? Or perhaps do you think that it's more pessimistic and that we will come into a new normal that will change human rights, workers' rights, and it will change the relationships in the world? So maybe in short, what do you think? What will happen in the end? What will be the new normal? Perhaps Zoltán could start.
I think yes, there is an interesting debate going on in Europe, as far as I can judge or tell, which is about taking or not the vaccine, because the individual's right not to choose to take the vaccine must be met with the right of others not to be infected by this individual. So I think the interesting debate, which is not only social but maybe philosophical as well, is regarding the freedom. What does it mean, freedom, in a situation like this? And I hope that in the end we will reach the point where we can agree that that not taking the vaccine does not give more freedom but less freedom, and not just and it doesn't give more freedom but less freedom to the others as well, and to this particular individual as well, I think. So it's an interesting debate, and I'm really interested what will be the end of this debate about freedom. In fact, what does that mean, freedom? To be free and to choose in this situation not to take the vaccine, which is risking others' health and risking others' freedom to live without an infection.
Jani, mogoče kako ti?
Jani, maybe you next. What is your view on the exit from the pandemic? I think we all think that we will come out of these circumstances. I would not like to answer epidemiologically speaking because I'm not a doctor. I think we are in the beginning of the 4th wave, and I hope that there will not be a 5th. I hope that we will be able to live normally after this. But given the circumstances, our topic is fear and courage, the twins. I'm also I have a double view. I'm an optimist and a pessimist. I think as a pessimist that social differences are centrifugal forces in society. I think there will be always ever bigger differences in society in crisis situations. On the other hand, I'm an optimist because I see in Slovenia as well as in Austria, even in Hungary, everywhere we can see a new birth of the civil society. We see civil initiatives that are here, they are visible. Some are cycling, some are walking on the street, some have some other ways. And this is inspiring. I think we can be optimistic about that. How this will end, what will come out of it, I don't know. But it's not that we have given up, that we are that there are a lot of people who want to take their destiny into their own hands. That's my answer. Yes, take their fate in their own hands. At least this is positive. Kristina, maybe I can ask you, what are you optimistic or pessimistic about society and what's happening here? Zoltán and Jani already said some things that I think are essential. There's the question of freedom, about which I thought about a lot at this point. The question about whether we'll be more free or less free if we're vaccinated. In connection to technology that is enabling this conversation right now, I think that on the level of individuals, I can be optimistic. There are some initiatives that go towards a fuller life. The wider picture does not seem to me as light, but it wasn't very bright before neither. A freedom in the philosophical sense is something that we have to work towards. We have to find it in the circumstances, in the social circumstances that are not the brightest, and we hope that the end result will be critical and good. It's always going to be a challenge, but that's life. Yes, I think you said it well. I think we can all agree that life is like this. We never expected it's going to be easy, but I'm happy that you all were kind of optimistic. I'm glad that you see something bright in this. For the end, I left Mr. Milan, not because he's the writer in focus, but I think that his answer will be the most optimistic. So, Milan, what do you think? What will happen in the end when we come out of this tunnel on the bright side? What will society be like after the pandemic? I was a bit startled with this term, new normal. I do not want a new normal. I don't want normal at all. If writers are something at all, we are descendants of shamans and those interpreters who connected sky and earth, heavens and earth. We are descendants of those universal powers that open the depth of man, of people. We do not want normal. What I want to point out today, what bothers me today, is that we want some power with literature. That we say that we do not have power with literature. First, we have to say what kind of power we want. If we're talking about a political power, we can be glad that literature does not have this power anymore, because that would indeed be the end of creativity. Literature, if literature is critical of the power, I think this is normal. And now I'm talking about normal. As we were talking about roses before, they give color to life, and so does literature. But literature has to be a detail. It has to be something that's on the edge. In a very tense political situation, we are always talking about politics, even though we are not politics. And that's why I would like to end with a quote. Again, I like to quote because I think others' thoughts are better than mine. Now I will use a quote of Karel. Yes. Political guilt becomes moral guilt, where the power is not restricted, but where the government restricts it. And poets are in this world to take care of the earth out of which a wideness of living and soul can grow. We can only take care of that, so that it's not directly connected to politics. If I go back to Kotzbeck, we will have to change the way of thinking about the world. We will have to stop the violent, nihilistic, subjective overpowering of the world. I want to go back to gentleness, the gentleness towards the world and to our close and not so close beings, but not only live beings, but also everything else that's there. Thank you, Milan. There were some technical difficulties, but I hope that the recording will be okay. The technology wanted to defer you from criticizing technology. This can also say something about the time we live in. Thank you, Milan, Dekleva, Jani, Oswald, Kristina, Hočevar. Thank you, Zoltán, Danyi. Thank you for being guests at this round table. It's hard to say round table because we're not sitting together. I want for all of you who are watching a bit later, so at the date when we post this, I'm still inviting you to Vilenica. I'm very happy to meet all of my today's guests live at Vilenica, and it will be much easier live than it is here with this distance. So the invitation stands that you join us at the festival, at all the events that will be taking place live in Ljubljana, in Kras, and elsewhere. I'm also looking forward to this, that no matter what, pessimistic or optimistic, that we will get out of the pandemic and that we will have learned something from all this. I hope that literature will be able to live among people in society. I agree with Milan that we do not need a political power, but I do think that we need this power to change society and the world again for the better. I see that it's becoming dark in Zoltán's place.
Right.
Sun is coming into my room. So now I'd like to thank you again, all of our guests. It's the time to say goodbye. I will see you at Vilenica, and I wish you a lovely day, evening, or